The funny thing is, the trailer cost my neighbor more money after I had it towed than it would have cost him to rent a storage space for an entire year. By the time he showed up at my front door demanding answers, he'd already ignored multiple warnings, ignored a property survey, and ignored something that should have been obvious to any reasonable adult. When something belongs to somebody else, you don't just help yourself to it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This whole thing started with a trailer and a mistake I made, which was assuming people would respect boundaries without being forced to. I live in a small town called Ashwood, a quiet place where most people know each other well enough to wave, but not well enough to know each other's business. My house sits near the end of a dead-end street, and one of the reasons I bought it was because of the extra access behind the property. There was a gravel strip running along the back fence that connected to a service alley. It wasn't fancy, but it made life easier. When contractors came over, they could bring equipment through the back gate. When I ordered landscaping materials, delivery trucks could unload closer to where I needed them. Every spring I'd spend a weekend leveling the gravel, pulling weeds, and making sure everything looked neat. It wasn't exciting work, but it was my property, and I took pride in keeping it maintained. One Monday morning, I walked into my kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, looked out the window, and noticed a trailer parked near the alley behind my lot. It was one of those long landscaping trailers with metal mesh sides, the kind you see hauling commercial mowers around town. At first I barely paid attention to it. I figured somebody was working nearby and would come get it later that day. No reason to think twice about it. The next morning it was still there. Same spot, same angle, same trailer. I remember standing there for a second thinking that was a little odd, but I still wasn't concerned. Then another day passed. And another. By the third day, curiosity got the better of me. I walked outside and headed toward the back fence to take a closer look. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen from the house. The trailer wasn't just near my property. Part of it was actually on my property. The passenger side wheels were sitting several feet onto my gravel strip. Not beside it. Not next to it. On it. I stood there staring at those tires longer than I probably should have. Most people would have looked at that gravel and assumed it belonged to the alley anyway, but I knew exactly where my property line was. I'd bought the house 6 years earlier, and I still had all the survey documents from closing. That gravel belonged to me. Every inch of it. Still, I wasn't interested in creating drama over a few feet of gravel. Maybe somebody misjudged the boundary. Maybe they genuinely didn't know. So instead of getting upset, I started asking questions. A couple houses down lived an older man named Carl. He'd been in the neighborhood forever and knew everybody. When I asked him about the trailer, he immediately laughed. "That's probably Nolan's," he said. "Guy over on Cedar Lane." "The landscaper?" I asked. Carl nodded. "Yep. Leaves that thing wherever he finds space." I laughed politely at the time, but something about that answer stayed with me. Wherever he finds space. Apparently wherever he found space now included my property. A few days later the trailer disappeared, and I assumed that was the end of it. Then it came back. Then it disappeared again. Then it came back again. After about a month, a pattern started becoming impossible to ignore. Every few days that trailer would show up behind my property. Sometimes it sat there overnight. Sometimes several days. Sometimes it was empty. Other times it was loaded with commercial mowers, fuel containers, blowers, and enough equipment to start a landscaping business from scratch. What bothered me wasn't even the trailer itself. It was the attitude behind it. Nobody had ever knocked on my door. Nobody had ever asked permission. Nobody had ever said, "Hey, would you mind if I parked this here for a day?" The decision had simply been made without me. Little by little the weight of the trailer started damaging the gravel. Deep tire impressions formed. Stones got pushed aside. Areas that had been level became uneven. Every time I fixed one section, the trailer would return and undo the work. Then one Saturday morning the situation finally stopped being a minor annoyance and became a real problem. I had a delivery scheduled for a backyard project I'd been planning all summer. The truck was bringing several pallets of retaining wall blocks, and the easiest access point was through my rear gate. I walked outside early that morning expecting everything to go smoothly and immediately felt my stomach drop. The trailer was back, right where I needed the truck to unload. I remember standing there holding my coffee and actually laughing to myself because the timing was so ridiculous. The delivery driver eventually managed to work around it, but the entire process took longer than it should have, and by the time everything was unloaded, my patience was pretty much gone. That afternoon I decided to talk to the owner. Not argue. Not threaten. Just have a normal conversation between neighbors. I walked over to Nolan's house. He answered the door looking relaxed and friendly enough. I pointed toward the alley and said, "Hey, I wanted to ask you about that trailer parked behind my property." He immediately smiled. "Oh yeah, it's been ending up on my gravel strip." He looked genuinely surprised for a second. "Really? Yeah, it's actually on my property line." He glanced toward the alley and shrugged. "Man, I didn't think it was bothering anybody. I only leave it there between jobs." I kept my tone calm. "I understand. I just need the space clear." He nodded immediately. "No problem. I'll keep an eye on it." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No tension, no argument, no raised voices. As I walked back home, I honestly thought the issue was solved. For about a week it looked like I was right. Then one rainy Thursday morning, I walked into the kitchen, looked out the same window, and felt my jaw tighten. The trailer had returned. Same position, same tires sitting on my gravel, same complete disregard for the conversation we'd already had. And standing there watching rain drip off that trailer, I realized something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a choice. And I had a feeling that choice was about to cost somebody a lot more than they expected. Over the next few days, I tried convincing myself it wasn't worth getting upset about. Life is busy, people make mistakes, and the older I get, the less interested I am in turning every annoyance into a battle. But there was a problem with that logic. Every time I looked out the window, the trailer was still there. Rain continued falling throughout the week, and because the trailer was loaded with equipment, the weight pushed deeper into the gravel than ever before. Water pooled inside the tire ruts. The stones I'd spent years maintaining were now mixed with mud. What had once been a clean access strip looked like a construction site. One Saturday morning I walked out there with a rake and a shovel, and as I stood looking at the damage, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was frustration mixed with disappointment. I had given this guy the benefit of the doubt. I'd spoken to him respectfully. I'd treated him like a neighbor. And somehow I was the one standing in mud fixing damage caused by equipment I didn't even own. That's when I decided I needed certainty. Not assumptions. Not guesses. Certainty. I dug through a filing cabinet in my office and found the folder from when I bought the house. Inside were inspection reports, closing documents, permits, and most importantly, the original survey. I spread everything across my dining room table and spent the better part of an hour reviewing measurements. Then I grabbed a tape measure and headed outside. The more I checked, the more obvious it became. There wasn't any gray area. There wasn't some confusing easement or disputed boundary. The gravel strip belonged entirely to my lot. The trailer wasn't partially on my property. It was unquestionably on my property. I actually laughed when I realized how clear it was, because suddenly all the doubt disappeared. The facts were simple. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being territorial. Somebody was repeatedly using my land without permission. So I took a photo of the survey. I highlighted the property line and sent it to Nolan in a text message. My message was polite. Maybe too polite. I wrote, "Hey Nolan, I checked the survey just to be sure. The gravel strip is definitely part of my property. Can you please make sure the trailer stays off that area going forward? Thanks." About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. His response consisted of exactly one thing. A thumbs up emoji. That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just a thumbs up. At the time I took that as agreement. Maybe that was my second mistake. 2 weeks passed. The trailer stayed away. During those 2 weeks, I almost forgot the whole situation. The gravel dried out. I repaired the damaged sections. Life returned to normal. Then one Tuesday morning I left for work before sunrise. When I returned that evening, the first thing I saw pulling into my driveway was the trailer. Same spot. Same angle. Same tires sitting on my gravel. I remember gripping the steering wheel and just staring at it through the windshield. It wasn't the trailer itself that bothered me anymore. It was what it represented. I'd had 2 conversations now. One face-to-face. One documented in writing. I'd shown him proof. I'd asked respectfully. And somehow none of that mattered. I sat in my truck for a minute thinking about what to do next. Part of me wanted to march straight over there. Another part of me knew exactly how that conversation would go. He'd apologize. He'd promise not to do it again. Then eventually, it would happen again. Because the issue wasn't whether he understood. The issue was whether he cared. And based on everything I'd seen, he didn't. A few days later, I ran into Carl while checking my mailbox. He asked if the trailer situation had been resolved. I laughed. Not exactly. He shook his head before I could even explain. Let me guess. It's back. Yep. Carl smiled, the kind of smile older people get when they've already seen the ending of a story. Some folks only learn lessons when they get expensive. At the time I thought he was joking. Looking back, he was predicting the future. That weekend I started researching local towing regulations. Not because I planned on using them immediately. I just wanted to know my options. I called the city office first. They referred me elsewhere. That office referred me to another department. Eventually, I ended up speaking with someone who explained the rules regarding unauthorized vehicles on private property. The conversation was surprisingly simple. Can you prove it's your property? The woman asked. Yes. Have you told the owner not to park there? Multiple times. Then you have options. Those 3 words stayed in my head. You have options. For months I'd been acting like the situation was happening to me. Suddenly I realized I didn't have to tolerate it forever. A few days later I called a local towing company and asked the same question. The driver I spoke with sounded like he'd handled situations like this hundreds of times. If it's on your property and you've got documentation, we can remove it. Even if it's a trailer? I asked. Especially if it's a trailer. What do you need? Property verification and access. That was it. No complicated legal drama. No courtroom. No detective work. Just proof and permission. Even then I still didn't call for a tow. Believe it or not, I wanted to give Nolan one final chance. So I bought a bright weatherproof notice sign from a hardware store. In large black letters it read, "Private property. Unauthorized vehicles subject to towing." I attached the notice directly to the trailer where nobody could miss it. Then I stepped back and looked at it. The message couldn't have been clearer if I'd painted it on the side with a billboard. For a moment, I honestly thought that would be enough. Any reasonable person would see the notice and move the trailer immediately. The next morning the trailer was still there. The following morning, it was still there. Another day passed. Still there. Every time I drove past it, I became more amazed. It was almost impressive. At some point, ignoring reality requires actual commitment. By the 4th day, my decision was made. I woke up early, poured a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out the window one last time. The trailer hadn't moved an inch. I picked up my phone and called the towing company. The dispatcher answered and asked for the address. I gave it to her. She asked if the vehicle was still there. I said yes. Then she said, "We'll send someone over." After hanging up, I felt surprisingly calm. No guilt. No excitement. Just calm. I'd spent months trying to solve the issue politely. Every reasonable option had already been exhausted. An hour later, I heard the sound of a diesel engine coming down the alley. I looked outside and saw a tow truck turning the corner. The driver climbed out, introduced himself, and reviewed the survey documents I'd already printed. He compared the measurements, walked the property line with me, looked at the trailer, then nodded. Looks straightforward. Those were probably my favorite words of the entire experience. Looks straightforward. No debate. No confusion. No argument. Just facts. He returned to his truck, lowered the equipment, and began hooking up the trailer. As the chains tightened and the trailer slowly lifted, I couldn't help feeling that months of frustration were finally starting to disappear along with it. What I didn't know yet was that the most interesting part of the story wasn't the tow itself. It was what was about to happen when Nolan got home and discovered his favorite free parking spot had suddenly vanished. The trailer was gone in less than 15 minutes. That's probably what made the whole thing feel so surreal. Months of frustration, countless moments of irritation, multiple conversations, damaged gravel, ignored warnings, and in the end the actual solution happened faster than a pizza delivery. After the tow truck disappeared down the alley, I stood there for a minute looking at the empty space. For the first time in months, I could see the entire gravel strip again. No trailer, no equipment, no giant metal reminder that somebody else thought my property existed for their convenience. Just my land exactly the way it was supposed to be. I spent the rest of the afternoon working in the backyard and almost forgot about it. Then around 7 that evening, there was a knock at my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Nolan stood on the porch looking confused, irritated, and more than a little stressed. He didn't even bother with small talk. "Have you seen my trailer?" he asked. I remember having to work very hard not to smile. "Actually, yes." His eyes narrowed. "Where is it?" I leaned against the door frame and answered calmly. "A trailer parked on my property was removed earlier today." For a second, he just stared at me. You could almost see the realization happening in real time. Then came the reaction. You had it towed. I did. Seriously? Very seriously. He threw his hands into the air. Come on, man. I couldn't help noticing that this was the first time he'd sounded genuinely concerned about the situation. Not when I talked to him the first time. Not when I sent the survey. Not when I repaired the damage. Not when I posted the warning notice. Only now, when the problem was costing him money. Nolan, I said, I asked you more than once to stop parking there. It was only for a few days. I laughed. That's what you said the first time. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because the truth was, there wasn't much he could argue with. The facts weren't on his side. He knew it. I knew it. We both knew it. Do you know how much it's going to cost me to get it back? He asked. Probably less than the amount of time and money I've spent dealing with it for months. That wasn't meant to be sarcastic. It was simply true. The conversation stalled after that. He looked frustrated, but frustration isn't the same thing as having an argument. Eventually, he shook his head and walked away. The next day, I learned from Carl that Nolan had spent most of the afternoon recovering the trailer. Between the towing charge, storage fees, transportation, and lost work time, the entire situation had become significantly more expensive than simply renting proper storage in the first place. Carl found the whole thing hilarious. Told you some lessons get expensive, he said. The funny part was that after all those months of acting like my property line didn't matter, Nolan suddenly became extremely interested in boundaries. The trailer never returned. Not once. Weeks passed, then months. Every morning when I looked out the kitchen window, the gravel strip remained exactly as I'd left it. No surprise visits, no tire tracks, no new damage. Eventually, I repaired the remaining ruts and spread fresh gravel over the entire area. By summer, you couldn't even tell there had ever been a problem. Then something happened that I genuinely didn't expect. About 3 months later, I was working in my front yard when Nolan walked over. This time he wasn't angry. In fact, he seemed almost uncomfortable. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary neighborhood stuff, weather, lawn care, local construction projects. Then he finally got to the point. Can I ask you something? Sure. He hesitated. If I ever needed temporary access back there again, would you consider letting me use the space if I asked first? I actually appreciated the question because it showed he finally understood what the original issue had been. The trailer wasn't the problem. The disrespect was. He'd never asked. He'd simply taken. But by then my answer was easy. No. He nodded slowly. Not angry. Not offended. Just accepting it. Fair enough. And honestly, I think he knew that answer long before he asked the question. Trust is a funny thing. It takes time to build, and almost no time at all to lose. If he had knocked on my door on day one and asked permission, there's a good chance I would have said yes. Maybe not forever, but for a day or two. Probably. That's what neighbors do. They help each other. But every ignored request, every broken promise, every return visit from that trailer chipped away at that possibility until there was nothing left. Looking back now, the whole situation taught me something I wish I'd learned earlier. Being patient is a good quality. Being understanding is a good quality. But neither of those things means allowing people to take advantage of you. There comes a point where protecting your boundaries isn't rude, it's necessary. And sometimes the most effective response isn't yelling, arguing, threatening, or getting revenge. Sometimes it's simply enforcing the rules that already exist and letting people deal with the consequences of their own decisions. To this day, whenever I look at that gravel strip, I don't think about the trailer anymore. I think about how easy the entire situation would have been to avoid. One conversation, one request, one small act of respect. Instead, it ended with a tow truck disappearing down an alley and a very expensive lesson about private property. But here's the part I'm curious about. If you were in my position, would you have had the trailer towed when I did, or would you have given him one more chance? And if you were in Nolan's position, would you have expected a neighbor to keep being patient after multiple warnings? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I have a feeling people are going to be split on this one. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had a neighbor completely ignore a boundary they thought didn't matter, right up until it did.